Hi, and welcome to the second part in my Sun Tzu's Art of Warhammer, and this is very much brought on by getting back into Warhammer after some time, looking at a lot of battle reports online, people playing games of Age of Sigmar in particular, and identifying little areas where I'm thinking of making tactical errors there, and drawn back to the days when I was getting myself ready for tournaments when it was Warhammer Fantasy Battle. And of course, using Sun Tzu's Art of War. It's something that's applicable to many areas of life, and an awful lot of it, unsurprisingly, is applicable to even simulated fantasy wargaming on a tabletop. So last week I talked about army building and what Sun Tzu said about that. This week I'm going to talk about what he would say about deployment, because after you've crafted yourself an army which, going to a tournament, hopefully will be suitable for not only dealing with the various battle plans you'll have to engage in, but also a variety of opposing armies, hopefully. Deployment is the next most important thing. Again, it's something you can do without undue influence from your opponent. Of course, it should be partially reactive to what your opponent is doing, and it sets you up. Good deployment will set you up for grabbing the objectives quickly. It may even cause your opponent to rethink their battle plans if you are not playing to their strengths and potentially challenging their weaknesses. Whereas ineffective deployment can mean one of two things. It might mean that first couple of turns you're having to rectify your errors and therefore wasting time. Or it might mean committing yourself to the original battle plan, because it's better to do that than it is to try and rectify the situation, especially if there are objectives to capture which give you victory points from the off. So the first quote from Sun Tzu, which is relevant to this, is carefully compare the opposing army with your own so that you may know where strength is superabundant and where it is deficient. So what you should do ahead of a tournament, I would say, is you need to know absolutely what are the strengths and weaknesses of your army. That is absolutely crucial. And that is generally with your army, but also specifically with the roster you have come up with. But you should also have an idea of the general weaknesses and strengths of the various armies you could potentially be pitted against. Then when you exchange rosters and you can have a look through it, then you can see specifically what are their great strengths and what are their weaknesses. And you need to quickly decide, when it comes to their weaknesses, how can you exploit them? When it comes to their strengths, you need to be very careful. You need to think to yourself, can I eliminate those strengths? If so, how do I do it? So that's where you start to develop tactics. If you don't believe you can reliably eliminate them, and certainly don't do what some people do and rely on a tactic where you need to get lucky with rolls, because you cannot expect that to happen. So if you can't eliminate it, or you make the judgment that you can't eliminate it, then you need to avoid it. Then you need to decide, how do I avoid that strength? Now, the next quote from Sun Tzu was, "The clever combatant imposes his will on the enemy, but does not allow the enemy's will to be imposed on him." So what you need to consider, now that you know what your opponent's got, you've seen the army set up, you've looked at the roster, they've done the same with yours, think about their fears and desires. So in terms of desires, you may be able to see from the makeup of their army what their intended plan is. Has it got lots of fast units, in which case they're likely to want to grab objectives quickly? Has it got a lot of firepower, in which case they're likely to want you to come onto them so they can blow you to smithereens? Think about what they've got. If they've got a lot of magic, then again, think about how is that going to be used? What spells have they got? Is it defensive, protective magics? Is it offensive magics? Thinking about these sorts of things as well. You may be able to use their desires to goad them into rash action by tempting them. But then you look at their fears. This is super important for deployment. If you've got something that you think your opponent will be afraid of, you can potentially use that in deployment to get them to rethink their battle plan. And of course, if they rethink a battle plan quickly, there is a high chance of error. For example, if you've got a particular unit that would be very devastating against a weak flank, you may be able to corral them. Similarly, you may have ways of getting them to stretch out their forces. For example, I am developing a Nighthaunt army. One of the main features of Nighthaunt army is that at least, well, no, up to half of them don't have to be deployed at the start. They can be deployed later on in my movement phase, where I can place them anywhere on the battlefield as long as it's more than 9 inches away from my opponent. That will become important, because then my opponent, if they're afraid of that, if the units that I'm going to say, right, I'm going to deploy those later, if they look at them and think that could absolutely mug some of my units, they will be unlikely to want to have those units left alone. They may stretch out their army, thus making a very weak line that is easy to attack, just so that they stop you deploying in their deployment zone. But in actual fact, by the time they've done that, it may not matter. You can deploy it anywhere, because the other units will also be able to attack weak lines. The next quote was, by holding advantages to him, he can cause the enemy to approach of his own accord, or by inflicting damage, he can make it impossible for the enemy to draw near. So there's two types of areas with your army. Of course, you know you're going to be getting into close combat at some point. That's the meat of Age of Sigmar. But you want to be able to determine where that is and with which units. Some of your units will not want to get into close combat. Some of them absolutely will. So how do you get your opponent to come on to the ones that want to get into close combat? And how do you prevent them going to the ones where you don't? You may have some units, for example, that are just there to capture an objective within your deployment zone or very close to it, but you don't really want to get involved in any messy combats. Well, there's a couple of things you can do to deter an opponent. You could have large, tough units of infantry, such that an opponent looks at that and just thinks to themselves, all I'm going to get myself into if I go there is a protracted fight where I'll never be able to whittle down enough numbers to get, the outnumbering necessary to capture the objective that they've got. The other thing you can do is have overwhelming firepower. If there's one thing that's going to dissuade an expensive elite unit from going to a particular part of the battlefield, it's a massive artillery barrage. Unless, of course, they're none too clever. I was watching a battle report just today, and it was very disappointing. I had to stop watching it after the first turn, not even the full battle round, just the first turn. It was between Legions of Nagash, with a Neferata character in it, and Caradron Overlords. Of course, as you'd expect, a lot of artillery in that army. And the Legions of Nagash player elected, for reasons best known to themselves, to place Neferata in the most advanced position they could, which is pretty much halfway up the table. Needless to say, in the very first turn, the Caradron Overlords got the first turn. Of course, that's 50-50. So you certainly don't come up with any deployment that relies upon you getting the first turn. You may not. And blew it away. This person never got to do anything with their Neferata. It was completely destroyed. And it wasn't lucky rolling either. The first roll from the first artillery barrage was actually very lucky. But after that, there were a few unlucky ones. So it all balanced out. It was asking to happen. What should a character such as that be deathly afraid of? No pun intended. Shooting and potentially mortal wounds. And that was a hell of a lot of shooting. Nothing was going to stand up to that realistically. She was certainly not. That was careless deployment. You mustn't play into your opponent's strengths. You need to do the exact opposite. A shooting army generally wants to stay back and just have things come onto it. So you must make it advance and try to get around it and pick it off piecemeal if you can. In terms of getting an opponent, however, to be drawn onto you, this is where you can use the objectives. If you're able to capture the objectives, then they have little choice but to engage you, because that ultimately is how you're likely to score a major victory in Age of Sigmar. The next quote was, "The spot where we intend to fight must not be made known, for then the enemy will have to prepare against a possible attack at several different points." Now, with this one, it's a little bit trickier because there are objectives and they are known in advance, and it's very likely that each player is going to want to fight in or around those objectives. But with some battle plans, you want those objectives as early as possible because you get victory points for each turn you have them. For some of them, there are victory conditions which can allow you a few turns of general movement and combat before you have to worry too much about the objectives, as long as you're not giving yourself a situation where your opponent could easily grab all of them and then win at one stroke. So what you want to do is to take advantage of deep striking units I've talked about before, as well as fast units. It's because otherwise it's very difficult to know what to do to confuse your enemy. It's not like in the old days of fantasy battle with pitched battles where the objective was only to crush your opponent's army and they didn't know where the strike would come. You still need to create that sense of the unknown. You need to be able to capture objectives, sure, but don't necessarily have to go for winning on objectives early on. You can just make sure that you're not going to be behind, and then after that, work on striking your opponent where they're going to be weakest. With deep striking type units, of course, you have a lot of options for where to set up. And again, this, if it doesn't affect your opponent, if they don't try and spread themselves out too thinly because they're not going to fall for that, then you need to decide where is the weakest points to place these. But you could also use very fast units. Now, it's quite important with very fast units that when you deploy them, where it's sensible to do so, you give them potential different lines of sensible advance. If you place very fast units right out on a flank, it's fairly obvious where they're going to be going. You're leaving your opponent in no confusion whatsoever. And I'm not saying very fast units must be placed in the centre, but if they are at least placed where you could go for one of two objectives or one or two lines of attack on opposing units, then you create an element of the unknown. And in a situation like that, if your opponent thinks, okay, well, both of those would be weak, in a weak position against it, they'll try to reinforce it. That will then take away some strength elsewhere. Which brings me on to the final quote from Sun Tzu on this one. It's a bit of a long one, but it very much gets the idea across. For should the enemy strengthen his van, he will weaken his rear. Should he strengthen his rear, he will weaken his van. Should he strengthen his left, he will weaken his right. Should he strengthen his right, he will weaken his left. If he sends reinforcements everywhere, he will everywhere be weak. This is the importance of having priorities. Far too often, people might be tempted to try and reinforce everything. They don't want any units to fall at all. It may be unrealistic to finish a battle unless you're going to win it in very convincing form without losing some units along the way, potentially without even losing some characters. You may even lose some powerful characters. As long as you don't throw them away by chucking a fifth of your unit into an artillery barrage before you can even use it, then the sacrifice can be worth it. Focus on the objectives. How are you going to win a major victory in this battle? It is largely determined by capturing those objectives. So, how can you do that and strengthen those areas there? Don't allow yourself to be spread out by an opponent who looks like they're attacking several different lines. Think about the strengths of your opponent. If they look like they're attacking down 3 different lines, which one are you actually worried about? Make sure that that is the one that is reinforced. When it comes to the battle objectives, of course, different battle objectives will have differences in there. But the advantage when you go to a tournament is you'll usually see, I looked at a rules pack for Games Workshop's Age of Sigmar tournaments, the official ones. And of these 6 battle plans in the core rulebook, you have 5 fights, so you're going to use 5 of them. So if you have a general strategy for your army to quickly and grab and hold objectives for all 6 battle plans, of course you will need to adapt it depending on what opponent you get and how they deploy. But at least you'll have a working plan that you just need to then tweak and adapt as necessary during the battle. So I hope that gave you some food for thought in terms of deployment, the art of deployment, the preparations for deployment you can even do in advance. It shouldn't just be a turn up, oh, well, I'll decide how to deploy depending on the battlefield or depending on my opponent. There's an awful lot of things with your army, if you've carefully considered it, that you can actually do in advance and then simply have to be critical of it and change it as and when necessary. So if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content, share with others who may also be interested. Next week we'll be looking at initial engagement. And until next time, I'll see you later.